Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement with Wayne Mulder, and I am your host, you guessed it, Wayne Mulder. This is the podcast where we help law enforcement overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. On today's 157th, yes, I know, I just said 157th episode of the podcast, the only thing that can save American society and make a positive difference for law enforcement. And it's under attack. But first, this is our weekly monologue show. It's called Morning Roll Call. I hope you're enjoying this format, but be sure to check out our other show, which is The Interview Room. Comes out on Thursdays. Completely different format. Sit down with somebody, usually from the law enforcement profession, or at least some ties to it, and we discuss all sorts of things that matter to you. So be sure to check that out. All episodes are on YouTube, they're on Rumble, and we really do try to focus on video. In fact, you should see, and will see, I'll throw up some images here on the screen of some changes to the studio. So great things are coming, and as many of you know, we put out a new logo and so forth as well. So you're going to see those changes in the coming weeks. Be sure on theblueline.com for more on everything that we are doing. All right, a few things I want to go over this week in today's episode. But let me start with referring to last week's episode. So if you haven't listened to last week's Morning Roll Call, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. It was episode 98. I spent a fair amount of time talking about the tragedy out of Memphis with Tyree Nichols, and I really wanted to talk about what were the takeaways, what were some of the common sentiments out there, and what was true and what was not true, at least in my opinion, which, when you run a podcast, you get to give your opinion. So that's what it is. As with any situation, when you give your opinion, you get dissenting opinions or dissenting views. 90% of the time when I see them on the social media, and especially like TikTok, I ignore it 100%. However, every once in a while, it feels like it may be legit. So I, at least give them a little benefit and I respond. And so somebody kicked back and felt that my interpretation, my opinion of the federal government's role was weird, is the term they use, but incorrect as well. So I want to be clear about something, though, and I thought I made it pretty clear, but just in case there were any misunderstandings, I want to make it extremely clear that I 100% believe in law enforcement oversight, accreditation, and so forth. We must self-police. We must hold ourselves to a high standard. And to that end, I believe that most agencies do in this day and age and at this current time. However, what I was saying and what I also believe to be true is that it is not necessarily, again, there's always room for discourse, necessarily the role of the federal government. In fact, I believe that most of that should belong 100% at the state level. And really the conversation and what I was trying to say to this individual is that the question really comes down to a federal, where you feel the role of the federal government is in your personal life, whether you believe it should be a stronger centralized federal government or a stronger state government. And ironically, this conversation has been going on since the 1700s. So the chances of us fully solving it today on this podcast, not great, but we'll give it a try. That's all I can say. The other thing I want to do is just let you know I received some really good news in my real job, though I am hoping this becomes my real job, and that's only possible with you listening, so thank you for listening. But really good news. As you all know, I can't talk specifics. It's funny, just this week I was having a conversation with somebody, and we were like, hey, the podcast the day after I retire, it's going to be like a Dr. Phil episode or something. Like I'm just going to be breaking down, just pouring out all sorts of information because there's so many things I can't talk about and won't talk about until that day comes. But it is suffice to say, I got some really good news, and I really look forward to it. Involves serving in a different capacity, and it involves being able to make a difference, continue, hopefully, to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And that is the goal, whether it's in this podcast, it's in my profession, or it's in my family, and is also the point of today's episode. So let's get to it. Last week, as I referenced, I spoke about the Tyree Nichols tragedy. I gave a law enforcement viewpoint on what I believed it was and what I believed it was not. So there is a guest or a host. He's not a guest. There is a host Though I do hope, if he's listening, which I'm sure he is not, but Jason Whitlock, if you are listening, someday I would love to have you on the Blue Line podcast. So any of you out there who know Jason Whitlock, if you give him a shout out, if you could be like, hey, Jason, there's this weird guy. He, talks about law enforcement. And here's why. So Jason Whitlock, he's a Blaze personality on Blaze TV, and he is the host of Fearless with Jason Whitlock. What I love about his show, what I love about things he says, is he really does a great job of digging into cultural issues. He talked about this Tyree Nichols situation and breaking down law enforcement's role and in society's role. He actually talks a lot about law enforcement, which, he also talks a lot about sports, which is his bread and butter. But he talks a lot about law enforcement related issues, but he talks about it from the other side of the equation, which is what I just find it so engaging and so important, especially this time that we're in, because it really gives a different perspective. That there are core issues in society that are creating some of these flashpoints that we're seeing in law enforcement and so forth. So I want to watch this video here. This is, he got a lot of kickback, a lot of negative pushback from people, your typical, who you would expect, on Twitter and on other engagements. He had been on Tucker Carlson, had a couple-minute spot where he talked about what he was seeing with the Tyree Nichols situation. That led to all hell breaking loose. So then he felt, and rightfully so, that, hey, in a longer format, which is a podcast type situation or his show, he was able to then dig deeper into it and give more context. And really, I thought he did a great job of describing how the breakdown of the family unit, the breakdown of leadership, the breakdown, as he put, male leadership, which I know is not a popular topic, but again, being a guy, I can only speak to guys, so we'll just leave it at that for now. But the breakdown of male leadership and in our communities and in our churches and in our families and so forth are really what's feeding a lot of this. And he talks about how he is who he is because of his father. So these clips are edited because, first of all, I had to edit them for time. I highly, highly recommend, if you enjoy his content or if you haven't checked out his content, there are links in the show notes. Go there and watch the full episode. The full episode is like an hour plus or minus. He has some guests on there, and you'll get a full context of what Jason is saying. But let's listen to what he has to say on this topic.
But the truth is, I am who I am, good and bad, because of my father. I feared and revered him. He taught me the importance of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and never accepting a handout. He had no tolerance for excuses. And luckily, I grew up in an era when there was far less pressure to conform to a criminal black stereotype. Rappers weren't portrayed as heroes and role models. It wasn't cool to have a baby mama. I was raised to see myself as a leader, a protector, and a provider. The left frames men like me, regardless of color, as a misogynist oppressor. Popular culture promotes the woman king, especially to black people. They ignore the failing results of matriarchal rulership and send women like Sarah Lynn Davis to fix problems only strong, bold male leadership can solve. It's going to take male leadership in the home, in the church, and in law enforcement to fix the rotting culture that took Tyree Nichols' life.
So really what he says here is so powerful, right? He is who he is, good and bad, because of his father. And how this breakdown, this push away from leadership in our families is also what is leading to some of these societal issues. And later on in the video, he goes into this in a little bit more depth where he actually compares it on both sides of the equation to both what we saw from the law enforcement response, what we're seeing in police agencies, and then also what we're seeing with the community at the same time. So let's watch this clip real quick.
And I'm not even blaming her for that. Because policing unparented children en masse in these major cities has to be one of the most difficult jobs in all of the world. And to do that in this environment where policing has been denigrated, where police, if they make any mistake, it can cost them their freedom and potentially their lives.
See, the first thing I want to point out, and he does a great job of describing this isn't a race issue. This isn't a black, white, Asian, etc. This is not a race issue It's a human heart issue. It's a culture issue. It's an acceptance issue of a culture that is antithetical to a strong family unit. I remember when I grew up, it was always, there was like a prioritization teaching that you got. And I was getting this in school, which that's a whole nother conversation we'll get to in a minute. But you would get this, as God first, family second, government third. Like there was a hierarchical start. And with government, it was more a national identity. So it was, your love of country was third. So love of God, love of family, love of country. Do you not see that as that has been attacked? In fact, it's literally been flipped on its head because people with, as I so often talk about, that what I'm talking about are differing worldviews. And if you take somebody with an opposite worldview of me, it's literally the opposite, except family is probably below God because for many people with a different and opposite worldview of what I have, God and government are interchangeable because they see it as one and the same. They see government in the role of God. We saw this all through 2020, and we see it now in the continued insanity that is still going on in some parts of this country. So first of all, this isn't a race issue. And second of all, as I mentioned a minute ago, I can't really speak to the female side of this equation because, well, I'm not one. And since there are only two options, I can't speak to it. But what I can speak to is the lack of male leadership in churches and in businesses and in our country as a whole, right? So there was an article. This is coming from America First Policy Institute. It's an article called Fatherlessness and Crime, where he broke down a fact sheet of what does the absent father and how does an absent father affect all aspects of a child's life? And they have all sorts of statistics on here. I'm not going to read every one of them. I'll put them up here on the screen so you can see them. But this is coming from Jack Brewer, and this was in 2022 that these statistics are coming out. So approximately 18,395,000 children in the United States live without a biological father, stepfather, or adoptive father present in the home. 23% of children in the United States are raised by a single parent. This is the most interesting part of that equation. That is 3 times the world average, which is 7%. Fatherless children are more likely to suffer from psychosocial development issues, live in poverty, drop out of school, engage in school violence, abuse substances, or enter the juvenile justice system. And if you're going to push back on that a little bit, I suggest that you just run a simple Google search and then follow the rabbit hole into all the different articles that are out there. For instance, the Minnesota Psychological Association has a peer-reviewed article where the abstract says exactly this. The number of single-parent households in the United States has reached the highest levels in recent decades. And as an extent, literature suggests that children raised in single-parent households experience more physical and psychological problems compared to those raised in two-parent households. The implications of homes and where fathers are absent may be important to explore for criminal justice and mental health professionals. And the article goes on in this peer-reviewed study to describe the different ways that absence of strong leadership in the home is then leading to some of these mental health. And if you're like, well, I don't know about that, I don't know if I buy into that, well, then in your search, read the article, Fatherless Families is the Root Cause of Crime in Baltimore. Go on to father absent homes, implications for criminal justice, the effects of a father absence and father alternative. On and on it goes. I honestly got so much research for this conversation that I was like, short of writing a paper on it, there was really no sense in going any further. As everything I say, do your own research. Look into it, look it up, see what you think. But at the end of the day, I think the stats are pretty clear. So single fathers are absent from approximately 80% of single-parent homes. Approximately 41% of children are born to unwed mothers. And for women under 30, the out-of-wedlock rate increases to 53%. That's more than half if you're doing math or, you went to a traditional school like I did. 63% of youth. So here are the fatherless children and risk factors. So this is where it really came home for me, where I looked at these tragic statistics. So here, again, I'm going to put them up on the screen for you. 63% of youth suicide victims are from fatherless homes. 90% of homeless and runaway children from fatherless homes. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions. 85% of youth in prisons. 80% of rapists. Fatherless children are 6 times more likely to live in poverty and commit criminal acts. than children raised in dual parent households, and approximately 85% of children with behavioral disorders have been raised in fatherless homes, which is 20 times the national average. Fatherless children are 3 times more likely to be behind bars by the time they're 30 years old, suffer from alcohol and substance abuse, on and on and on. From 1980 to 2010, the arrest data of fatherless boys aged 10 to 14 increased by 50%. Most adolescents who enter the justice system have suffered from parental abandonment, substance abuse, or a dysfunctional household, which of course that's something different, that we can define. In a study of 75 juvenile delinquents, 66% experienced fatherlessness, 20% never lived with their father, and 25% had an alcoholic father. Minimal parental involvement, which is something I want to talk about today, unstable family dynamics, and the development of attachment issues, all common consequences of a fatherless home, contribute to an increased risk of juvenile delinquency. Fatherless children are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated than children raised in a dual parent household. And then when it comes to fatherlessness and school violence, 71% of teachers and 90% of law enforcement officials, again, the articles that I was just referring to here, state the lack of parental supervision at home is a major factor that contributes to violence in schools. In a study of 56 school shootings, only 10 of the shooters, 18%, were raised in a stable home. 82% grew up in either an unstable family environment or grew up without biological parents together. So this week, I had the privilege of being on a podcast. It's the From Embers to Excellence podcast with David Hollenbeck. Dave, as you'll recall, was on my show, and I believe that it's not only going to come out on his podcast. I think he also has a deal where it comes on like an internet radio station. When that show releases, be watching on theblueline.com or on the social media, and I will push that out so you can listen to it. What I really liked about this episode is it was a little bit different questioning than I've gotten on some of the other shows that I've been on. Typically, we always talk about law enforcement mental health. We talk about resources that law enforcement needs to consider and all of those things, which really are the driving conversation that we have here at On the Blue Line. But we also delve into some of these societal topics. And the reason we delve into them is because as society breaks down, as we have issues in the culture, those directly affect the law enforcement officers and the men and women out there on the front lines doing the great job that you all do each and every day. What I liked about this conversation, though, is Dave brought up a good point. He said, what is law enforcement administration's or leaders' role? So speaking specifically of leadership, what is their role when it comes to law enforcement mental health? And I really enjoyed that question because that is so often overlooked, that when we talk about the need for things like peer support or crisis intervention or on and on it goes, all sorts of things to deal with law enforcement mental health, where it really rises and falls is on leadership. So the answer to the question is everything. It means everything, because without the proper leadership, without the proper people steering the ship and getting you to where you need to go and bringing these resources in and making sure that people understand they're there and advocating for them and so forth, without that strong leadership, it all breaks down. And so then taking this to a different direction or taking it a little bit further, I have to ask you, right? And speaking primarily to men, ladies, not neglecting you here. Again, I'm a guy. I kind of have to talk to guys. But speaking to men, what are you doing? What are you doing to be a better leader in your family? What are you doing to be a better leader in your place of work, in your social circles? Do people know where you stand on things? We live in this crazy time where the culture in a lot of ways is kind of disintegrating around us, right? It kind of feels like things are out of control, and even in our day-to-day job and on the streets, we're like, oh man, we see the impacts of things like fatherlessness. And I hear or I feel the kickback already, this opinion that it's like, well, how's that my problem? Like, how am I going to solve this? This isn't my situation. I mean, my kids live with me and my significant other, and we're, our family's good and so forth. Here to me is the question, right? And I can only come to these type of issues from a point of self-reflection. I can only come to it from looking at my own anecdotal experience, my own moments in my life where I had to ask myself, am I doing what I need to do here? I was actually on 2 interviews this week, and on the other one, they asked the question, what do you most regret? What is the thing that you wish you would have done differently? And to that end, I answered it with, I wish in the early days of my son being born that I wasn't concentrating so much on trying to build a business back then. And it speaks to a bigger issue. Because we as law enforcement, you go to work every day and you're just tired. You're dealing with people's problems and they have issues, and you're trying to solve this and you're trying to be Superman, and then you're getting kickback and some people dislike you, and you see it in the media, and you feel like all these movements, they're all pressing against what I'm doing, and you get tired of it. Like, you get home and you want to watch Netflix, or maybe you're the type that wants to just play video games. If you're younger than me, maybe you're of this video game generation. So you're like, you know what? I'm just going to check out, put this headset on, and I'm going to go blow things up or whatever it is you do in your video game. Or maybe you're the type that's going to veg out on Netflix, or maybe you like to work on things. So you go out and, I'm going to work on, all these vehicles in my yard, or I'm going to go whatever it is, but it becomes escapism. I saw this in my own upbringing. I saw what happens when people get so frustrated with things in life and so frustrated in feeling that there's nothing they can do, that in turn, they just kind of go into a shell. They check out. And men, we do this so often enough that if you're in the sound of my voice, you're probably thinking, either maybe your father did that, maybe you've done that in one way or another. Now, I want to be clear, there is something called decompression and resetting, and that's very, very important. But you can't always be decompressing. In fact, at some point, you have to ask yourself what you're decompressing from, if that's all you're doing is decompressing. It'd be like being on vacation full time. At some point, that's no longer vacation. That's just your everyday life, which, okay, that's good if that's the situation you're in. But as we see things in society break down, as these conversations are happening, and quite frankly, if you don't think society is breaking down, I would suggest you turn something on, say the news, any of them, and just watch. There are major, major issues in society. And if you're in this career, you know that. And what I don't like, what I am seeing, what I am trying to speak to here is you and I have a role in influencing those around us. We have a role in influencing our own family. Are we doing that? Or are we checking out? Are we just going to work, going through the motions, and then coming home and that's it? Maybe you have a platform, maybe, and you're like, well, I don't want to do, any more than I'm doing or whatever. And that's fine. But you've been put in certain places, in certain environments, like this podcast for me. This isn't the amount of time and money and energy that goes into this. It's not at this point one of the smarter business decisions I've ever made. It's honestly more about the mission. It's more about being able to come here and bring these conversations and these important things to you so that hopefully it makes a difference in your life. Well, the same is true in your circle. Maybe it isn't a podcast. Maybe it's as simple as having a conversation with your son or your daughter when you get home. Maybe it's as simple as going back to having dinner at the family table. And I get it won't happen every day if you're in this career. Not with the 12-hour shifts, not with the varying days, not with the working holidays. Those things aren't going to happen. But what are you doing in the environment in which you've been given to influence those within your circle of influence? And then while you're influencing them, are you speaking truth? Are you acknowledging truth? We live in a time where people honestly believe that subjective truth is all there is. And I'm here to tell you that's absolutely not true. There is objective truth. Everything is not subjective to your whim. What you feel like today really has nothing to do with it. Just because you feel like a peacock doesn't make you a peacock. It's true with everything. No matter what topic, what we're talking about, there is such a thing as objective truth. Do you know it? What do you stand on? What's your belief system? And then the last thing I want to talk about there is engagement. I was just talking to someone, I wish I could remember the full context of it, but I was just talking to someone this week. And in that conversation, they were talking about projects going on. It was with their children's school. And they said that they showed up and it was like a work type day. And, they needed to get all these different things done. The only people that were there, and there were projects that required, both sexes. Both, there were like strength type projects and projects that required both sexes to be engaged in this. And yet only the women showed up. No men showed up, only the women showed up. I hear that kind of story over and over again. And you know what? I've been guilty of it as well. There were times that, like when my son was in Boy Scouts and so forth, that I prioritized other things that maybe I shouldn't have, and I should have been there. And I think that if we, and again, speaking to the men, because I'm speaking as a man, if we don't start to engage in our families, in our communities, in our churches, I don't know how many times I hear from pastors and from others that, the only people who are active in the church are the ladies, which God bless them. I'm glad that they are. That's not my point. My point is what are you doing? That's my point. What are you doing? What am I doing? Right? Why aren't you filling this void? Why aren't you willing to show up? Why do you think that the only way to get through life is to hide? That's not leadership. That's not engagement. That isn't your calling. That isn't the way it's supposed to be by any stretch of the imagination. So my final thoughts for today: we've raised a generation of people who are more concerned about their personal satisfaction, pampering, and fulfillment than the future success and stability of those within their circle of influence. You and I are also guilty. I don't know how many times I've chosen wrong, chose personal enjoyment over involvement in the life of my son, with others with whom I must engage. The reality is that we all have done it, and we've all, in one way or another, we have failed. We live in a culture where the breakdown of the family is not only accepted, it's celebrated. The Overton window has moved so far that it's become the expectation and the norm, if you would. However, statistics tell us over and over again where this road leads. And we can only do one of two things. We can sit here, we can continue to watch Netflix, play video games, or 1,000 other ways that today's parents and adults choose to check out and hide, or we can choose to engage. Speaking specifically to men, I can feel your angst. I can feel where you're at because I've been there. And I ask you, are you escaping or are you engaging? Do you know what time it is? Do you influence your kids? Do you have any involvement in their schooling? I can tell you that nobody will be a better parent to your children than you. Nobody will be a better leader in your family than you. Nobody will play the part that you alone were called to do in your community than you, because you are uniquely placed in the environment that you are in for such a time as this. And do you understand what time it is? This show is currently aimed at law enforcement. That means the vast majority of you that have seen the tragic effects of fatherlessness and broken families. You have seen what happens when we try to legislate ourselves out of problems that can only be improved with a heart change. Are you engaging? I know our career has a tendency to make us want to retreat. We are tired, we're just over dealing with people. We're over dealing with problems. We don't want to make decisions. We simply want to escape. And to be clear, as I said, there is a time for decompression and to reset. But don't hear what I'm not saying. If you are only decompressing and if you are only resetting, then that's not resetting, that's escaping. I say it over and over and over again. I believe that law enforcement is in a unique position. You are in a unique position to save society. And if you're questioning if society needs saving, well, that's a conversation that's going to be much longer and for a different week. But for now, let's just pretend that you actually have some knowledge of what's going on, if maybe you just watched the news for one day this week. But back to my point, the skills that make great law enforcement officers, make great people, make great leaders, make great change agents. Coupled with the skill sets that you gain from this career, when, and only when, grounded in truth, you are in a unique position to save Western society. If you question this, think for only a moment about the organization who made it their stated, written in black and white, I can show it to you on the website, mission to destroy the nuclear family. They are the ones hell-bent on destroying law enforcement also. They say ridiculous statements like defund the police, and they support anarchy and destruction. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if you are the enemy of the enemy, then you are probably on the right side. That does it for this week's Morning Roll Call. I'll see you Thursday in the interview room, next Monday in Morning Roll Call. But in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.